that is responsible for incentivizing innovation and clean renewable energy. So how do you overcome sort of the politics of it all?
Well, I think one of the ways we're overcoming the politics of it all is the rise in price in energy and the growing realization that the climate situation is an imperative that we have to deal with. So that perfect storm, if you will, of understanding, I think will help us get through some of that. One thing that we look at is the incentives. I mean, it's ridiculous, I believe, and that's a pretty strong word, but I'm using it specifically. It's ridiculous that the Congress is letting the energy efficiency tax incentives go by the by for commercial buildings, for homes, that they're not extending and expanding them for vehicles. That's a way, it's an investment by this country that is going to return more to the economy than it's going to cost us. And we're going to do it while we're lowering CO2 and other pollutant emissions. So I think, that's a way. And putting a price on carbon, as difficult as that will be, whether it's through a tax or whether it's through a cap and trade program, again, when people are paying sort of the loaded cost for energy use and what it's really costing our economy and our environment worldwide, then I think you get by this, because where energy efficiency works best is where the per unit cost of energy is high, and where you have programs where some of that extra cost is being pumped back into the pipeline and into energy efficiency programs. So people in New York, for example, pay some of the highest electric rates in the country on a per kilowatt hour basis, but their bills aren't any higher than the national average, and oh, by the way, their consumption has stayed flat while the rest of the country's has grown. So it can be a win-win.
Interesting.
Go
ahead if you wanted to continue.
Okay, just a couple. This is the crystal balling, so I'll kind of wrap it up with this. I mentioned earlier that there's phenomenal growth in energy demand, and when you look at it, and this chart shows it and where we can expect that to happen. But the growth in the world's energy demand means that we're going to have to find ways to meet that. We're going to have new supplies. We're going to have to better bring forward conventional supplies. But we think the first way to meet it is the way in which you do it with the least environmental footprint, no environmental footprint, and that's to bend the demand curve down and use energy efficiency. So that's an imperative that we have, and again, I mentioned study after study is showing that, well, in the U.S., for example, we could, according to McKinsey, actually flatten the growth in energy demand through investment in energy efficiency. Worldwide, we can lower significantly by more than half the growth, and at the same time, we can get halfway to the goals that the IPCC and climatologists say we need to meet, which is 450 to 550 parts per million of carbon, so that we don't have a rise in temperature that will do catastrophic things to the planet. So it's an issue. And the next slide shows, I think, looking ahead, climate, the way we do legislation in the United States at a federal level often is that it bubbles up from the state levels. And if you look at this map, which is very busy, what it shows you is that 27 states in the United States have committed to controlling carbon, and another 5 states are looking at doing that. So when you start to get that kind of action at that level and generating that kind of momentum, I think it translates into federal action.
Tom Buckley writes a question, says, aren't incentives and carbon taxes just a redistribution of wealth by the government?
It depends on how it's done, would be my answer to that. And yes, there will be some redistribution. We need to be careful about how we do this. We don't want to wreck the economy in putting a price on carbon. We don't want the load for doing this to be borne by those who can least afford it. So when you look at the legislation that's up in the Congress, the funds that would be created by a tax on carbon or by effectively putting a tax on carbon through a cap and trade program, they are looked at how you spend those and direct those so that we do it in a way that is most effective for the citizens of the United States, the manufacturing base here, and most importantly, the consumers or the voters who policymakers care about. Speaking of that, the climate legislation, the debate started and ended last week. It was mostly process related and some political posturing and no real discussion of the substance of what needs to be in there. We believe that waits for the next Congress. This slide just shows kind of the state of play of what has been going on there. But I do believe that we will see some type of climate legislation in the next Congress.
I've heard reports that this is really a dress rehearsal
yes.
for the upcoming Congress. Is that, you think that they'll be more receptive and that it'll be the opportunity to revisit?
I think so. I think that that's most observers believe that. And if you take a look at, which our next slide has, Jackie, where the candidates are, and I didn't update this after Senator Clinton stepped out 2 days ago, but she and Senator Obama had virtually identical platforms in terms of a cap-and-trade program and what they would do with energy policy. Mm-hmm. But McCain is a recognized, one of the first in the Senate as a Republican, no less, to come out and call for cap-and-trade legislation. So I think that whoever is in the White House, you're going to see leadership that we have not had on this issue in terms of bringing forward federal legislation. And I think that's what carries us over the top. I think the pressure from the states, the pressure from the international community, combined with leadership in the White House, means we'll get some form of legislation. I'm hopeful that it'll be a thoughtful debate and that it will get by the politics of it, and we'll start looking at what makes the most sense. From the view of an advocate of energy efficiency, the first solution we should look at is energy efficiency.
But we find a lot of this does stall out when it hits sort of government debate or congressional debate and conversation. Do you anticipate that this conversation will flow more smoothly now because we are hitting a problem of too much energy dependence or gas prices being too high? Do you think that maybe the scene is now set to get past those political divides?
One would hope so. I've put a slide up for the viewers that I think helps us because, we don't have to do it all at once necessarily. We could take some incremental steps. Simply pricing carbon is not necessarily going to be enough to drive energy efficiency. You're going to need complementary policies like we talked about with respect to building codes, appliance standards, and incentives. This slide is very, very busy. Again, it comes from McKinsey. But if you focus on the columns that go below the lines, those are investments that made, all of the investments that are shown above and below the line are the abatement measures that can be taken to get us for $50 or less a pound of carbon. And if you look at what's below the line, that actually means that those are a net gain to the economy, the investments that would be made. They're not going to cost the economy. They're going to pay more back to the economy than they cost. And if you start looking at what those are, they're investments largely in energy efficiency. They're improved fuel economy in vehicles. They're using combined heat and power. They're using better lighting systems. So these are all things, and it leads me a long answer to your question. But if we can focus on energy efficiency, I think it's the sweet spot. I think it gets us by a lot of what we're doing right now in terms of fighting over whether this can be done or it can't be done. Let's do as much as we can with energy efficiency, and then let's go on and do the other things that we know we're going to need to do. But let's start there. Let's get some agreement. There's no reason, because this isn't just a win for the climate, it's also a win for the economy, and it's a win for energy security.
I think one of the things throughout the day that we're running into is how do you encourage people to make that investment up front in order to see the payoff down the road? Because immediately there may be some cost that may seem prohibitive. How do you encourage people, from your perspective, to put that money in to see that money come out?
Right, and I think that's where we head. Public education and outreach is going to be huge. The Save Energy Now program that I talked about, showing businesses how they can do it. Businesses like Dow and DuPont and others being leaders, showing the way. I think that's going to be very important. I put a slide up, though, because, again, we have to get by these market barriers that are out there. We need to deal with the transaction costs that are going to be higher. So we need to make sure that we educate people to either show them that a small investment now has large paybacks very shortly, or if they're cash strapped, which so many Americans are right now, we find a way to bring the cost of the energy efficient product down to the level, at least for a while, till it gets a toehold in the market, volumes can go up and prices fall naturally, that it can compete on a level playing field with the non-efficient products. One of the greatest, I think, education tools is the Energy Star label, which was developed by the federal government, EPA and DOE working together. It's an easy visual that people can look for, and it's, each product is different, but as a general rule of thumb, products with the Energy Star label are going to be 30% more efficient than a product in that same category that doesn't have the label. So things like that we can show people, and it's going to take the federal government working together.
A quick question from Corey Vanderpool. It's a little off topic, but it's interesting, and I don't know the answer to this. What do you see as the